A destitute single mother gave her last warm drink to a grieving stranger, unaware he was the city's most powerful CEO looking for a reason to live. You are an unfit mother, and I will see to it that those children are removed from your squalor. The rain hammered down on the thin apartment window like 1,000 desperate fists, relentless and wild. Elara watched the rivulets of water trace frantic paths down the grimy glass, each drop a reflection of the tears she refused to let fall as she clutched the crisp, cruel eviction notice in her trembling hand. She was alone. The silence in the tiny, threadbare living room was a heavy blanket, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of her twin daughters, Lily and Rose, asleep in the adjacent room. Their innocent faces, framed by halos of blonde hair on a shared pillow, were the only source of light in her darkening world. A world that had once been filled with laughter and the steady presence of her husband, Mark, now felt cavernous and cold, haunted by the echoes of what was lost. The worn photograph on the mantelpiece showed him smiling, his arms wrapped around her, a lifetime of promises shimmering in his eyes. That shimmer had been extinguished in the screech of tires and the splintering of metal one foggy morning a year ago, leaving Elara to navigate the wreckage. She smoothed the crumpled paper on the small wooden table, its bold red letters a brand of her failure. 30 days. 30 days to find a miracle or be cast out onto the unforgiving streets with the two most precious things in her universe. A quiet resolve settled over her weary shoulders. She would not break. For them, she would be unbreakable. She moved with a practiced hush, checking the lock on the door for the third time and pulling a thin, patched blanket over the sleeping forms of her girls. Their little hands were curled into loose fists, their dreams untroubled by the storm raging both outside and within their mother's heart. She touched a finger to Lily's cheek, then to Rose's, a sacred, unspoken promise passing from her to them. She would find a way. She always had to. The pantry was nearly bare, holding only a half-empty box of oatmeal, a few potatoes, and a single precious canister of tea leaves she saved for the coldest nights. It would have to be enough. She measured out a small portion of the tea into a thermos, filled it with hot water from the sputtering tap, and wrapped it in a kitchen towel. It was her one small comfort, a ritual of warmth she allowed herself before facing another day of searching for work, for hope, for a lifeline in a city that had grown indifferent to her struggle. She pulled on her threadbare coat, the fabric so worn it offered little protection against the biting cold, and slipped a small, worn rattle into her pocket, a talisman from when the girls were babies. The soft click of the door closing behind her echoed in the sterile silence of the hallway. The wind outside was a physical force, stealing the breath from her lungs and whipping her dark hair across her pale face. She walked past gleaming storefronts and warm, amber-hued restaurants, a ghost in a world of plenty. Her destination was the one place that cost nothing, the city park, where she could sit and gather her thoughts before beginning her daily, fruitless search for a job that would accept a grieving widow with 2 young children and no support system. The park was deserted, a landscape of skeletal trees and slick, black benches under the relentless downpour. But as she rounded a bend in the path, she saw him, a man, sitting on a bench facing the murky duck pond, utterly still, soaked to the bone. He wore simple, dark clothes that clung to his frame, and he stared into the gray water with a hollow gaze that she recognized instantly. It was the same haunted emptiness she saw in her own reflection on her darkest nights. He didn't seem to notice the rain or the cold or her. He was an island of profound, unspoken grief. She froze. Every instinct screamed at her to keep walking, to preserve her own meager warmth, to guard the small comfort she held in her hands. She had nothing to spare, not a single drop of kindness or heat. The world had taught her that lesson with brutal efficiency. But then she saw his hand, clenched into a white-knuckled fist on his knee, and the slight tremble that ran through his broad shoulders. It was a vibration of sorrow so raw, so deep, it bypassed all her defenses and struck a chord of sacred empathy within her own shattered heart. She knew that kind of cold. It wasn't from the rain. She hesitated for only a second longer, her own desperation warring with a selfless impulse she thought had long been extinguished. Then, with a steady breath, She walked towards him. The man didn't look up as she approached, his focus absolute. She stood before him, the rain plastering her hair to her cheeks, and held out the thermos. "You look colder than I feel," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the drumming of the rain. He finally lifted his head, and she saw his eyes. They were the color of a stormy sea, and in their depths was a pain so immense it was almost unbearable to witness. He looked at the thermos, then at her face, a flicker of confusion crossing his gaunt features. I don't have any money," he mumbled, his voice hoarse, as if from disuse. "It's not for sale," she replied gently, pressing the warm thermos into his cold, unresponsive hand. "It's tea. It helps." She then opened her cheap, flimsy umbrella, the one with a bent spoke that always threatened to collapse, and held it over his head, leaving herself exposed to the downpour. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain hitting the thin nylon. He stared at her, a strange light dawning in his hollow eyes, a seismic shift occurring in the landscape of his soul that he could not yet comprehend. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this simple, unsolicited act of kindness from a complete stranger who clearly had nothing, would change everything. "Why?" he finally whispered, the single word hanging in the damp air between them. Alara offered a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach her own weary eyes. "Because no one should have to face the storm alone." She held the umbrella steady for another minute, a silent guardian in the deluge. Then, with a final nod, she turned and walked away, leaving him with her only source of warmth and her only protection from the rain. She vanished into the heavy fog, a fleeting angel in a threadbare coat, never once looking back. He was left alone on the bench, the warmth of the thermos seeping into his frozen fingers, his world completely, irrevocably splintered. The walk back to her apartment was a trial of shivering misery. Without the umbrella, Alara was soaked through in moments, the biting cold seeping into her bones with a vengeance. Each gust of wind felt like a physical blow, and by the time she climbed the 4 flights of stairs to her door, her teeth were chattering uncontrollably and her body ached with a deep, encroaching chill. She slipped inside, the soft click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet space. Lily and Rose were still sleeping, their peaceful faces a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt. She stripped off her wet clothes, hanging the worn coat on a hook where it dripped a sad puddle onto the cracked linoleum floor. Wrapped in her oldest, most patched robe, she huddled under a thin blanket on the sofa, trying to stop the trembling that racked her fragile frame. The warmth from the thermos was a distant memory, sacrificed for a stranger's comfort, and now she was paying the price. By morning, the chill had blossomed into a raging fever. Her head pounded with a relentless rhythm. Her throat felt raw and scraped, and every muscle screamed in protest when she moved. But a mother's duty does not yield to sickness. With a will forged in love and desperation, she forced herself to her feet. She made oatmeal for the girls, her hands shaking so badly that she spilled some of the precious flakes on the counter. She winced at the waste. She read them a story, her voice a hoarse crackle, and built a castle of worn wooden blocks, her vision swimming in and out of focus. They were her world, her reason. She could not falter. The next few days were a blur of feverish half-consciousness and unwavering maternal duty. She drifted through the motions, her body screaming for rest that she could not afford to take. The eviction notice on the table seemed to mock her, its red letters glowing with malevolent glee in her delirious moments. She lost her part-time cleaning job at the downtown office building because she was too sick to show up, the phone call from her supervisor curt and final. Another door slammed shut. The small cushion of money she had painstakingly saved was gone, spent on medicine, bread, and milk. Desperation became a constant, suffocating presence. She was at the end of her rope, a frayed and tenuous thing about to snap. Meanwhile, miles away, in a stately, cavernous penthouse that overlooked the entire city, Adrian Vance held the now-empty thermos in his hands. He had not been able to get the woman from the park out of his mind. Her quiet dignity, her selfless act, her haunted but gentle eyes. They had pierced through the thick fog of grief that had enveloped him since he'd lost his wife and daughter in the same accident that had taken Alara's husband. For a year, he had been living a ghost life, his vast fortune a meaningless burden, his heart a sterile silence. He had been sitting on that bench on the anniversary of their deaths, ready to let the cold claim him, to simply give up. He had believed the world was a transactional, cruel place, a belief reinforced by the sycophants and opportunists who populated his corporate world. And then she had appeared, a woman with nothing who gave him everything she had. Her warmth, her protection. She had asked for nothing in return. It was the purest, most sincere gesture he had ever witnessed, and it had reawakened something in him, a flicker of light in the profound darkness. He had to find her. It became an obsession, a new purpose that pulled him from the abyss. He was Adrian Vance, a man whose resources were practically limitless. Finding one woman in a city of millions should have been simple, but she had vanished without a trace. He hired the best private investigators his money could buy, giving them only a vague description and the location of the park. He felt a fierce, protective urgency. What kind of life did a woman with such a worn coat and such weary eyes lead? What storm was she facing alone? Days turned into a week, and he grew more impatient. His return to his commanding corporate persona startling his employees. The quiet, grieving CEO was replaced by a man on a mission, his gaze sharp and his orders crisp. Finally, they found her. A name, Alara Vance. The shared surname was a strange, heart-wrenching coincidence. A photograph confirmed it was her. And then the details of her life unfolded in a grim report on his polished mahogany desk. A widow, twin daughters, an eviction notice, a lost job, a mountain of debt. A wave of cold fury washed over him, followed by a surge of profound tenderness. She was suffering quietly and with immense dignity, while the world remained indifferent. He knew then that he couldn't simply approach her and hand her a check. That would be an insult to the purity of her gesture. It would turn her sacred act into a transaction, the very thing he had come to despise. No, his help had to be as quiet and selfless as hers had been. It had to be a whisper, not a shout. The anonymous interventions began. A large box of groceries appeared on her doorstep one evening, filled with fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, and small treats for the children. Alara found it when she went to take out the trash, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and disbelief. There was no note, no explanation. She brought it inside, her hands trembling as she unpacked the bounty. For the first time in months, she could cook a real, nourishing meal for her daughters. She wept with relief, convinced it was a mistake from a local charity, a miracle she didn't dare question. A few days later, an official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. She opened it with dread, expecting another bill, another demand. Instead, it was a receipt. Her overdue electricity bill had been paid in full. The notice stated it was settled by an anonymous benefactor through a city assistance program. The lights would stay on. Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar feeling, began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. Then, a package from a high-end children's clothing store arrived, addressed to Lily and Rose Vance. Inside were two beautiful, warm winter coats, soft scarves, and sturdy boots. Alara stared at them, her mind reeling. Who was doing this? Who was this hidden savior, this guardian angel watching over her family? She felt a profound sense of being seen, of being cared for, that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. She had no one in the world who would do this for her. Her own family was gone, and Mark's mother, Mrs. Delacroix, despised her, blaming her for her son's death in the car accident she had survived. The kindness was a mystery, a golden glow in her otherwise gray existence. She didn't know that from a sleek, black car parked across the street. Adrian watched her apartment window, his heart aching with a feeling he couldn't name. He saw the light in her window stay on late into the night, and he knew he was doing the right thing. This was not about charity. It was about repaying a debt of the soul. She had saved his life on that rainy day in the park, and now he would quietly, secretly, save hers. He had to see her again, but it had to be perfect. It had to be a coincidence. Adrian orchestrated their next meeting with the precision of a corporate takeover. He learned from his investigators that Alara took her daughters to the small, local library every Saturday morning. It was their one weekly outing, a free and quiet pleasure. Dressed in the same simple, unassuming clothes he'd worn in the park, he sat at a table near the children's section, a worn copy of a classic novel in his hands, though he wasn't reading. He was waiting. His heart, an organ he'd long considered dormant, thudded with a strange anticipation. Then, the library door opened with a soft hush, and she walked in, holding the hands of her two small daughters. She looked less weary than before, the hollows under her eyes not quite as pronounced. She was wearing the same threadbare coat, a fact that sent a pang of guilt through him. He hadn't yet figured out how to give her a gift without revealing himself. The girls, however, were bundled in the new coats he had sent, their faces bright with excitement. They made a beeline for the picture books, their happy whispers echoing in the quiet space. Alara settled them at a small table, her movements gentle and patient. She looked up, her gaze sweeping the room, and her eyes met his. A flicker of recognition, then uncertainty, crossed her face. She knew him from somewhere. Adrian gave a small, hesitant smile. He stood and walked towards her, his steps measured. "From the park," he said, his voice low. "The other day." With the rain, understanding dawned on her face, followed by a faint blush. "Oh, yes, I remember. Are you all right?" The sincerity in her question was undeniable. After everything she was enduring, her first thought was for his well-being. "I am," he said, the words feeling truer than they had in over a year. "Thanks to you. You left before I could properly thank you, or even return your thermos." "It's just a thermos," she said, dismissing it with a wave of her hand. "I'm glad it helped." Her gaze dropped to the girls, who were now engrossed in a colorful book about a talking bear. A soft, maternal pride softened her features. "These are my daughters, Lily and Rose. They're beautiful," Adrian said, and he meant it. They were miniature versions of their mother, with the same serious, gentle eyes. He introduced himself simply as Adrian, omitting his surname and the empire attached to it. They spoke for a while, their conversation easy and natural. He learned about her love of classic literature, her dreams of being a teacher before life had intervened. She spoke of her husband, Mark, her voice cracking for just a moment before she regained her quiet composure. She spoke of his kindness, his humor, his unwavering belief in her. Adrian listened with an unwavering intensity that made Alara feel truly seen. Most people shied away from the topic of her grief, their discomfort a palpable barrier. But this man, this quiet stranger named Adrian, listened as if her memories were precious things. He didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward condolences. He just listened. It was a gift more valuable than any anonymous donation. He, in turn, found himself opening up in a way he hadn't with anyone, not even his closest advisors. He spoke of a profound loss, carefully editing the details but conveying the soul-crushing weight of it. "I lost my family," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It felt like the world had lost its color. Alara's eyes glistened with an empathy that was raw and real. "I know that feeling," she whispered. "Some days, the silence is the loudest sound in the world." In that shared, unspoken understanding of grief, a bond was forged. It was a connection born not of romance or attraction, but of two shattered souls recognizing the pieces of themselves in the other. When it was time for her to leave, a strange reluctance settled over him. He didn't want the conversation to end. "Perhaps I'll see you here again next week?" he asked, the question feeling more important than any multi-million-dollar deal he had ever negotiated. Alara smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her face. The girls wouldn't miss it. She was gone. As he watched her walk out of the library, a small, dignified figure flanked by her two brightly coated daughters, Adrian felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer about repaying a debt. It was about her. It was about the woman who saw a broken man in the rain and offered him everything she had. He wanted to give her back a world full of color. The secret interventions continued, growing bolder. One afternoon, Alara received a call from a prestigious downtown law firm. The secretary's voice was crisp and professional. An anonymous client, she explained, had established a trust fund for the education of Lily and Rose Vance. It was substantial, enough to cover tuition at any university they chose, with living expenses included. Alara's knees went weak. She had to sit down, the phone receiver slick in her clammy hand. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a cruel joke. But the lawyer sent over the paperwork, official and undeniable. Her daughter's futures, which had seemed so precarious, were suddenly secure. The weight that lifted from her chest was so immense she felt lightheaded. Who was this person? This phantom benefactor who was systematically rebuilding her life? Her thoughts immediately went to Adrian, the quiet, grieving man from the library. Could it be him? No, that was impossible. He seemed as lost and adrift as she was, a man of simple means and quiet sorrow. The idea was absurd. And yet, the mystery deepened, a puzzle she couldn't solve. Their weekly meetings at the library became the anchor of her week. They would talk for hours while the girls played. He told her about his love for architecture. She told him about her passion for gardening. They discovered a shared sense of humor, and for the first time in a long time, Alara heard herself laugh, a sound that felt both foreign and wonderful. Adrian found himself memorizing the details of her face. The way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the determined set of her jaw when she spoke of her struggles, the infinite tenderness in her touch when she smoothed her daughter's hair. He was falling in love, a concept he thought had died with his wife. This was different. It wasn't a replacement. It was a resurrection. It was a love that was quiet, steady, and profound, built on a foundation of shared pain and mutual respect. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to cast off his disguise and show her who he really was, to lay his fortune and his heart at her feet. But he was afraid. He was afraid that the truth of his wealth would taint the pure, simple connection they had built. He was afraid she would see him not as Adrian, the man who understood her silence, but as Adrian Vance, the CEO, a figure from another world. He didn't want to be her savior. He wanted to be her partner. So he waited, telling himself the time wasn't right, all the while watching her struggle. His secret interventions a poor substitute for the open, honest support he desperately wanted to offer. He was a king playing a pauper, and the lie was beginning to feel heavier than his grief ever had. The fragile peace that had settled over Alara's life was shattered by the arrival of a thick, cream-colored envelope with an ornate, embossed seal. Her heart seized the moment she saw the return address. The law offices of Delacroix and Finch. It was from Mark's mother. With trembling fingers, she tore it open. The legal jargon was cold and suffocating, but the message was brutally clear. Margot Delacroix was formally petitioning the court for full custody of her granddaughters, Lily and Rose. The document was a character assassination, painting Alara as a destitute, unstable, and unfit parent. It listed her recent job loss, her near eviction, her lack of stable income. Every hardship she had faced with quiet dignity was twisted into a weapon against her. Each word was a poisoned dart aimed at her heart. A raw, primal fear, colder and more terrifying than any poverty she had faced, washed over her. The thought of losing her children, the two beating hearts that were extensions of her own, was unbearable. It was a fate worse than death. She collapsed onto the worn sofa, the letter falling from her numb fingers, a sob catching in her throat. Mrs. Delacroix had never forgiven her for surviving the accident that had killed Mark. In her grief-stricken mind, Alara was a usurper who had stolen her son and was now raising his children in squalor. The anonymous gifts, the paid bills, the trust fund, none of it would matter in a courtroom. It was unexplainable, ethereal. Margot's wealth, on the other hand, was very real, very powerful, and she would use every ounce of it to crush Alara. The preliminary hearing was set for the following week. Alara felt a sense of impending doom. She had no money for a lawyer, No one to speak for her, no defense against the polished, cruel power of the Delacroix family. She felt utterly, completely alone. That Saturday, when she met Adrian at the library, she couldn't hide her distress. The light in her eyes was gone, replaced by a haunted, desperate shadow. He knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. "Alara, what is it?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. She hesitated, the shame of her situation a heavy weight on her tongue. But the steady, unwavering sincerity in his gaze gave her the strength to speak. She told him everything. About Margot's unrelenting cruelty, about the custody battle, about the terrifying prospect of losing her daughters. She didn't cry. Her voice was brittle but steady, her dignity a thin shield against the sheer terror that was consuming her. As he listened, a cold, hard anger solidified in Adrian's chest. It was an emotion he hadn't felt in years. It was the commanding fury of a CEO, a protector, a man who saw something precious being threatened by petty, selfish cruelty. He saw Margot Delacroix for what she was, a foil, a villain in Alara's story, and he would not allow her to win. But he kept his composure, his face a mask of calm empathy. He couldn't reveal his hand yet. "You need a lawyer," he said simply. "I can't afford one," she whispered, the admission costing her dearly. "Let me help," he urged, his voice gentle but firm. "I have some savings. It's not much, but we could find someone. A legal aid perhaps." Alara looked at him. At this kind, grieving man who had so little himself, offering to share it with her. The sheer goodness of the gesture brought tears to her eyes. "Adrian, I can't ask you to do that. You don't even know me." "I know you're the kindest person I've ever met," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "And I know you're a wonderful mother. Let me help you fight this in the end." She agreed, too desperate to refuse any offer of help. Adrian told her he would make some calls and meet her at the courthouse on the day of the hearing. He promised he would be there for her. As she left the library that day, a tiny, fragile seed of hope had been planted. She wasn't entirely alone. She had Adrian. She had no idea that Adrian was not calling a legal aid society. He was calling Marcus Thorne, the head of his corporate legal department, the most feared and respected litigation attorney in the state. He wasn't using his savings. He was mobilizing an army. The day of the hearing arrived, gray and oppressive. The courthouse was an imposing, sterile building of polished marble and heavy oak doors. Alara felt small and insignificant as she walked its cavernous halls. She wore her best dress, a simple, faded floral print she had owned for years. She held her head high, but inside, she was shattering. Margot Delacroix was already there, seated at the plaintiff's table, looking impeccable and severe in a crisp, dark suit. Her lawyer was a shark in human form, exuding an aura of smug confidence. They whispered to each other, occasionally glancing over at Alara with undisguised contempt. Alara sat alone at the defendant's table, her hands clenched in her lap. Adrian was nowhere to be seen. A wave of panic rose in her throat. Had he changed his mind? Had he realized her cause was hopeless? The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge, a stern-faced woman with tired eyes, entered. The proceedings began. Margot's lawyer stood and began his opening statement, his voice dripping with condescension. He painted a damning picture of Alara's life, presenting bank statements, the eviction notice, the termination letter from her job. He spoke of an unstable environment, of poverty and neglect. It was a performance of masterful cruelty, and with every word, Alara felt herself shrinking. She risked a glance at the judge, whose expression was growing more and more grim. Margot took the stand, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief as she spoke of her deep love for her granddaughters and her grave concerns for their welfare under their mother's unfortunate circumstances. She was convincing, poised, and utterly devastating. Alara felt the room closing in on her. All hope was vanishing. She was going to lose them. It was at that moment, her darkest and most desperate, that the heavy courtroom doors swung